All right, medieval art. Let's get started. As you can tell, very interesting period of art following the very realistic styles of Greece. What can you do? What is it? Medieval art is the umbrella term used to describe the art created between the fall of the Roman Empire in the early CE era to the end of the medieval era in 1492 following the expulsion of the Muslims. The art, like previous style, was composed of a multitude of mediums, including metalworking, painting, pottery, etc. Although it's around this time that art starts to get a little weird considering the cultural influences it draws from. This period of art is also well recognized for its iconic fusion of very Romanesque and also very barbaric European styles along with its heavy Christian iconography, as opposed to very previous styles that relied more on the mythology of the local areas. Art period is also very well known for its radical changes in art over the long, bloody history of the medieval era. It's presented here. Very, very simplified as compared to the very realistic statues and portraitures of people that was present at the end of the Roman Empire. Where was it used? This time around, there's no definitive empire that we could say it's attached to, as opposed to like the Romans, we could say it was the Roman Empire, or Greece, it was the Greece Empire. This time around, because of medieval art, it's more or less confined to the time period and area of medieval Europe, although the geography and borders of that is always constantly changing throughout this time. As presented here, considering this is what Europe looked like close to the peak of the Roman Empire, and this is what it began to develop like towards the beginning of the medieval era. Yeah, it just total mess. This here, we have early Christian art. It's important to note that around this time, many groups of people would play heavily influential parts in art, considering the very unique styles each group of people, such as the Visigoths, Goths, and Ostrogoths, would play in creating different types of art, but they would overall come together for a semi-uniform medieval style. So this is early Christian. This is what shortly followed after the fall of the Roman Empire and the unique style developed. This is Byzantine. Byzantine is heavily categorized by its very Christian iconography. This is from the migration period. This is largely categorized by the large movement of many peoples throughout Europe. It's largely associated with the very Scandinavian rise of power. This is from the migration period. Oh no, this is from the insular period. The insular period is very interesting in that it's very centered on bookwork, if you would, very ornate designs. This is from the Romanesque. This is where it takes the very bright and playful colors of the Roman Empire's art styles that it had collected over time and fuses it with the very simplified and yet elaborate designs of the medieval era at the time. And here we have Gothic. Now, it's important to note there's not a lot of Gothic art, if you would. There's a lot of Gothic architecture, because Gothic architecture is really where it started to shine. When was it used? Well, to be very blunt about it, it was, of course, used during the medieval era. So following the fall of the Roman Empire up until 1492. Although the style itself divides into more culturally and geographically significant portions depending on what part of Europe you were at the time. Trivia. Who wants candy? So, because of the heavy implications architecture played in the Gothic art style, many styles would be developed at the time. One of these styles, if you would, is archways. So, what kind of archway is that? Is it a round, an oogie, a two-door, or a McClunky? It is not. Anybody else want to take a guess? Yes. I don't even, to be entirely honest, I'm not too sure why they call it an oogie archway, but hey, what works, works. All right, famous practitioners. Master Mateo, a Spanish sculptor who lived in the second half of the 12th century, most famous for his Portico de la Gloria in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, as presented here. It's a pretty wild archway. In fact, actually, the entire church itself is very elaborately designed like this. Then we have Stefano di Giovanni, the Sasetta, an Italian painter who is recognized for his innovative use of Sienese and Gothic art fusion, if you would, during the Sienese Renaissance, of course. Fun fact, this is not the Last Supper, this is a Last Supper, as pictured here. Kind of sucks that your masterpiece gets outshined only like a couple hundred years later, but whatever. And then we have Duccio di Buonsenna, an Italian painter who was active in the late 13th and early 14th century, and is most famous for his altarpiece, the Meseta, presented here, which was commissioned by the, if I'm not mistaken here, Compagnia della Desia de Maria Vergine. Italian people were fun around this time. Spotlight, the Crusades. They lasted from 1096 to 1271, and the reason I point them out as the very bloody conflict between the Catholic Church and the Islamic Empire at the time, it's incredibly important to note that this was a large draw of inspiration. Considering the consistent contact and trade with the Muslim Empire at the time, they would draw many influences from the art style and culture at the time and implement it into art. As pictured here, you see the end of the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire at the times. The reason this is here, it largely points out where most of the Crusades were, because it's usually like right around here. Yeah, very fun time. It's also important to note that through the Crusades, it shows the large transition of power in medieval Europe from that of the ruling government to the very dominating Catholic Church at the time. Then we have the Black Plague. The reason I mentioned the Black Plague that lasted from 1347 to 1351 is because the Black Plague itself represented a very large change in the iconography of art at the time. As following a massive plague that kills a third of Europe, surprisingly enough, not a lot of people were happy at the time. Therefore, at this point, we see a very darker transition and much more intimidating art style developed through medieval Europe, as pictured here. Yeah, not a lot of people were stoked about the Black Plague. Historical significance. Of course, I can't undermine the historical significance of the medieval art, mainly because writing at this time was largely left up to speculation. So it helps us gain an interesting view of what is considered the Dark Ages at the time, despite the very innovative art styles that was used. It also represents the drastic cultural shift of Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire, considering medieval Europe is considered a far cry from what it used to be during the Roman Empire and previous empires before that. It also created works that are still found in the modern day, and medieval art itself would go on to inspire and be based on other arts, as many art styles would. And I mean, of course, we have some modern day examples of Gothic and medieval architecture, such as Westminster Abbey down there, and Llanfairpwllgwyngyll Church. That is a real name. I hate the Welsh. And again, medieval art really does play a big role into leading into the Italian Renaissance following shortly afterwards. Here we have some examples. I know it's kind of hard to tell what this image is. Fun fact, that's a Jonah and the whale, classic story from the Bible. I'm not too exactly sure what's going on here, and I have no idea what that thing is. Medieval art was fun. I'll leave it at that. And here we have resources. Any questions? Yes. Welsh is a very confusing language in that, like a lot of earlier English languages, they don't space out generally in a title. So if you were like a king of something, your full name, no space, would be one word. In this case, the title for that church, it means the woman of the white hollow under the fox woods. Hence why it's such a long name. Any other questions? All right.